what I want to urge upon you is militant atheism. Many of you probably subscribe to our polite cultural belief that we should respect religion. But I also suspect that a fair number of those secretly despise religion as much as I do. If you're one of them, and of course many of you may not be, but if you are one of them, I'm asking you to stop being polite, come out and say so.
They accuse the new atheists of having created something of a meaning vacuum into which other ideas can fill. I know that you respond to this by saying that you're against all kinds of nonsense and that should do the trick.
I'm accused of opening the door to wokery.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I understand that that's something that you have also had some choice words about. But even if you're against the thing that came to fill its place, can you still be held in part responsible for opening that door, even if you thoroughly condemn the thing that washes in after it?
You could, I suppose, yes. I wouldn't like to admit that, but I could imagine somebody saying that.
In this video, I would like to look back on the movement of New Atheism, which gained popularity in the early 2000s and which now seems to have left some people disillusioned. How did this movement start, and why did it develop the way that it did? I think a good starting point to understand the rise of New Atheism is the Cold War. Back then, the greatest enemy of the West was communism, and we had to resist it at all cost. It was understood that atheism was a core feature of communism, and therefore strong traditional religious institutions were seen as a bulwark against this threat. The more fundamentalist and hardline, the better. Nuance and open-mindedness are poor defenses against relentless attempts at subversion.
The first stage of subversion is the process which is called basically demoralization. It takes from, say, 15 to 20 years to demoralize a society. This is the time sufficient to educate one generation. These are the areas of application of subversion. In case of religion, destroy it, ridicule it, replace it with various sects, cults, which bring people's attention, faith, whether it is naive, primitive, doesn't really matter. As long as the basically accepted religious dogma is being slowly eroded and taken away from the supreme purpose of religion, to keep people in touch with the supreme being, that serves the purpose. Therefore, replace it, accepted, respected religious organizations with fake organizations. Distract people's attention from the real faith and attract them to various different faiths.
Other ways to resist communist ideology were to actively promote free market economics and to instill a strong sense of patriotism. This trinity of anti-communist measures may have led to a brand of Christianity that some could find confusing. A Christianity that does not particularly value critical thinking, that promotes the supremacy of one particular nation, that encourages the accumulation of wealth, and cares little for the poor. In the meantime, another worldview was also being promoted in the hopes to avert the existential threat of the Cold War. In 1980, Carl Sagan hosted a wonderful TV series titled Cosmos. It was more than just a science documentary. It was supposed to change the way we look at our own existence. In the final episode, Sagan tells about a bad dream where human life has become extinct due to nuclear war. He recalled the amazing journey of humanity, from the Big Bang to the formation of planets, to the first humans in Africa, to our first steps in space exploration. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. In spite of all our different cultures and traditions, we are all one species, living on a pale blue dot that we call Earth. This cosmic awareness should make us realize the foolishness of our destructive tendencies that jeopardize our own existence. Sagan concludes the series with these words: "Our obligation to survive and flourish is owed not just to ourselves, but also to that cosmos, ancient and vast, from which we spring." This worldview was already articulated by Albert Einstein in an essay on science and religion. He identified first a religion of fear, then a religion of love and morality, and finally a third stage of religious experience, which he called the cosmic religious feeling. Here, God is not imagined as a person who moralizes. There is no dogma or church. There is just a deep admiration for the cosmos. So we had several responses to the threat of communism. But at the end of 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and suddenly this existential threat was practically gone, at least in most Western countries. People in the West, born in the early 90s, grew up without experiencing anything of the Cold War. Rather, the first historical event that they consciously experienced was 9/11, an act born out of Islamic extremism. Together with this very peculiar brand of Christianity that was formed to oppose communism, it became clear to this new generation what caused all the world's problems: organized religion. It was in this environment where the new atheist movement took form. Indeed, the new atheists, such as Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Sam Harris, did work that understandably won the respect of many people. If somebody makes absolutely nonsensical scientific claims because of religious reasons, then you call them out for it directly and clearly. If an ideology causes significant social problems, then you call them out for it without caring for accusations of being racist or having a phobia. So the rise of new atheism seems understandable from this perspective. So where might they have been lacking? I think the fundamental and fatal flaw of the new atheist philosophy is best articulated by Christopher Hitchens himself.
Can you think of any religious spokesman you've ever heard who would tell you in advance what would disprove their hypothesis? Of course you can't, because it's unfalsifiable. And we were all taught, weren't we, by Professor Karl Popper, that unfalsifiability in a theory is a test not of its strength, but of its weakness. So you can't beat it. It's an infinitely elastic airbag. And there's no argument that I can bring or anyone else can bring against it, and that's what should make you suspicious. If it could be shown to a believing Christian, the grave of Jesus opened and the body of him found and the resurrection disproved, if that could be archaeologically done, for the sake of argument, it would presumably be a disaster for you. You'd have to think, then we're alone. Then how are we going to know right from wrong? What can we do? I maintain with Socrates that, on the contrary, the moral problems and ethical problems and other dilemmas that we have would be exactly the same as they are.
So the problem with religion is that it's unfalsifiable. And the benefit of atheist morality is that it's unfalsifiable. I have to agree with a combination of both points. The fact that atheist morality is unfalsifiable makes it extremely weak. If you want to maintain that rational evidence-based reasoning is important, and you believe in moral values, then you have to end up with Christianity. Its moral foundation is based on historical claims, which are supported by evidence. In a previous video, we briefly summarized some evidence for the historical reliability of the Gospels, and there are other channels that go much further in depth. The historical claims are most certainly falsifiable. For example, if there were overwhelming historical evidence that crucifixion was not a known form of execution in the Roman Empire at the time, then the Gospels and their resurrection claims can easily be dismissed as unreliable. Now, of course, one can always choose to remain skeptical of the resurrection claim, because skepticism can be applied as an infinitely elastic airbag. You can always come up with some fantastic conspiracy or assume some great coincidence to explain why the Gospels are not actually truthful. Also, in the natural sciences, one can never fully prove a theory, but only fail to falsify it after rigorous testing. But even if one finds the evidence for Christianity too weak, then the question is, can atheism provide any better foundation for moral beliefs? What could be the empirical evidence that a certain moral philosophy is true, and how can it be falsified? If this cannot be answered, then on what grounds can one even claim that religion is morally bad and scientific rationalism is morally good? I now want to argue why having a logically coherent foundation for morality is a serious issue with real practical consequences, rather than just some academic philosophical nitpicking. As a first example, I would like to recall Amos Yee, a Singaporean freethinker who was arrested for wounding religious feelings. Free speech activists came to his aid, and then he used his talent for critical thinking and right to free speech to defend pedophilia. This includes sharing scientific articles on his blog where he argued that he would like to abolish the minimum age of consent, though he is prepared to compromise and set the minimum age to 3 years old. This is not the first time that something like this happened. Already in the 1970s, prominent French intellectuals criticized the criminalization of pedophilia. Of course, I do not mean to suggest that each atheist necessarily arrives at this conclusion. Rather, what I would argue is that the secularist worldview that emphasizes personal freedom, free thinking, and scientific rationality leaves one with no basis to argue against this conclusion. If nothing is sacred, if every moral commandment should be open to questioning, then how can one argue against the defenders of pedophilia? If two individuals freely consent, and they don't harm other people, what scientific evidence or logical reasoning leads to the conclusion that we have the moral right to intervene in their personal lives and forbid their decision? More broadly speaking, why would anything be morally wrong, as opposed to merely evoking an uncomfortable sensation that has evolved only to optimize gene propagation?
The scientific outlook has taught us that some parts of our subjective experience are products of our biological makeup and have no objective counterpart in the world. The tastiness of fruit and the foulness of carrion, the scariness of heights and the prettiness of flowers are features of our common nervous system. And if our species had evolved in a different ecosystem, or if we were missing a few genes, our reactions could go the other way. Now, if the distinction between right and wrong is also a product of brain wiring, why should we believe it any more real? And if it is just a collective hallucination, how could we argue that evils like genocide and slavery are wrong for everyone rather than just distasteful to us? That's a statement by Steven Pinker.
Well.
As a second example of why it matters to have a logically coherent foundation for morality, let's consider another morally controversial issue, namely whether racial differences exist. What does the science say about this? According to science, humans and chimpanzees have a common ancestor. Since evolution is a very gradual process, this common ancestor must at one point have had different populations, which were members of the same species, but nonetheless had noticeable differences in intelligence, so that one population evolved to become the more intelligent Homo sapiens, while the other evolved to become the less intelligent chimpanzee. Since evolution is still occurring today, we must at the very least consider it a scientific possibility that there are certain populations amongst humanity who are at a fundamental biological level less intelligent than other populations. Indeed, scientific racism was accepted throughout the scientific community before the mid-20th century, but then it was suddenly not considered scientific anymore. Now, what might have happened during the mid-20th century that scientists suddenly realized that there actually are no such differences between races? Was it the purely objective, evidence-based, self-correcting mechanism of the scientific method that dispassionately updated our understanding of biology? And did UNESCO suddenly take a particular interest in theories of evolution that they subsequently published multiple statements on the issue of race? Of course not. This is fundamentally a moral issue, not a scientific one, as also statistician and biologist Ronald Fisher pointed out. It was the trauma of one of the biggest genocides in modern history that caused this tremendous change in mindset. However, if one maintains that it's objectively true that racism is morally wrong, and the only objectively true beliefs are scientifically proven beliefs, then the science must be forced to conform with these moral beliefs. By doing so, science has lost its objectivity and therefore its trustworthiness. Another moral issue is whether men and women should be considered equals. If that is a moral truth, and something can only be true if it is supported by science, then the science must be made to demonstrate that men and women are equal.
This is in Scientific American.
Yeah.
Less than a year ago. Inequity between male and female athletes is the result not of inherent biological differences between the sexes, but of biases in how they are treated in sports.
What you're saying is not Scientific American says that. An editor for Scientific American says that, who no longer has the job.
Why can't you just say this is not scientific and Scientific American should do better?
Well, does she still have her job?
No, not because of this. I said the scandal is not her tweet. The scandal,
Because that was like a year ago, was it? Which one was a year ago?
I think a year ago, women still couldn't beat men in basketball or any other sport. And it wasn't because of society. You don't see a problem.
By the way, long-distance swimming, women might actually have the advantage. You can look into that. Yeah.
Maybe long-distance swimming,
Yeah.
yes. Okay.
Yeah. I've looked into it. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to file you under part of the problem.
When scientific authority is blatantly used to enforce certain moral beliefs, then it is no surprise that the overall trust in science declines, whether it is about climate change or the effectiveness of vaccines. This is not much different from the accusation that religion is merely a tool to manipulate people. There are instances where religious authority is indeed abused, and therefore some people conclude that all of religion is a scam. If a total dismissal of scientific authority is considered detrimental to society, even if science can become corrupted, then perhaps it's worth considering whether something similar holds for the total dismissal of religious authority. To limit the abuse of both science and religion, it is important to realize where its authority starts and where it ends. So to summarize, if you accept Christ as your moral foundation, then your morality is rooted in concrete, falsifiable historical claims. Your morality has a rational basis. If you reject Christ, you have only your own subjective moral opinion. Even if it is dressed up as an academically respectable philosophy, even if it appeals to many people, at its core it remains unfalsifiable, and therefore it is little more than a faith-based belief. You can try to enforce that belief onto other people by hijacking science or by other means, but not by investigating falsifiable claims. Some new atheists claim that Christianity is irrational because one is required to believe in miracles, which defy the laws of nature.
It's interesting because I sort of thought that you would be more of a Hitchinite, God is not great advocate. But it's interesting to me that you see the value and the force for good of the United Kingdom having a Christian foundation.
Yes, but I must emphasize that I think that the things that Christians believe are actually nonsense. I mean, I think that when you say you waver, I wanted to ask you, do you actually believe that Jesus had a virgin for a mother? Do you actually believe he rose from the dead?
So, could one only be truly rational if one rejects the miracles that are recorded in the Gospels, even though there is positive evidence for their historical reliability? It reminds me of Petzvall's opposition to the existence of the Doppler effect. The Doppler effect had been observed experimentally, but Petzvall still objected on the grounds that the effect doesn't satisfy the mathematical form that Petzvall thought natural laws should obey. It didn't matter what empirical evidence was presented to him. His preconceived notion of how nature ought to work was more important. Skepticism of the gospel miracles tends to be of the same kind. People who witnessed those miracles were not unaware of the laws of nature. Their awareness of natural laws is the exact reason why they recognized the events to be miracles. They knew it was a clear deviation from how nature is supposed to work normally. That's why these events were worth recording and dying for. And if there is ever to be any empirical evidence that something supernatural exists, such as objective morality, how can that evidence be anything other than something that defies nature? The belief that nothing supernatural can exist, or that the natural laws that we typically observe cannot be violated ever under any circumstance, is a philosophical presupposition. It is not a rational conclusion that follows from empirical evidence.
What would it take for you to believe in God?
Well, I used to say it would be very simple. It would be, the second coming of Jesus, or a great big, deep, booming bass Paul Robeson voice saying, "I am God and I created." But I was persuaded mostly by actually Steve Zara, who's a regular contributor to my website, richarddawkins.net. He more or less persuaded me that even if there was this booming voice and the second coming in clouds of glory, the more probable explanation is that it's a hallucination or a conjuring trick by David Copperfield or something.
So that couldn't be enough. So what would persuade you?
Well, I'm starting to think nothing would. Which in a way goes against the grain, because I've always paid lip service to the view that a scientist should change his mind when evidence is forthcoming. The trouble is I can't think what that evidence would look like.
Therefore, disbelieving the New Testament accounts of miracles does not make one a more rational or more logical person. Quite the opposite. If you take the benefits of believing supernatural claims, but deny that they are actually true, then you admit to being willfully delusional.
So people often ask me, do you believe in God? Which I don't like that question. The answer to that question popped into my head. I act as if God exists. Then with regards to these other issues, the divinity of Christ, what do you mean by divine? And also, what do you mean by Christ?
It is this intentional delusion that replaces evidence-based traditional Christianity when we abandon it. We have business gurus borderline preaching eternal life and sacrifice for a just cause. We are offered not truth, but tricks to hack your own mind. Because to whom exactly do we owe this gratitude? In prayer, we know who we are thanking. But since prayer is irrational superstition, the rational alternative is apparently to express gratitude to nobody in particular. One might say, well, as long as these tricks work, does it really matter whether they are based on truth or not? I believe that truth matters a lot. Our perception of reality significantly affects our well-being. If a dear friend died, it will not console us to pretend that they have just moved away to a different country. The realization that someone we deeply loved truly does not exist anymore in any way, shape, or form will affect us to our core. And it is inevitable that everyone you will know will die, and that you will die. We can distract ourselves from this reality with hobbies, relations, or ambitions, but sooner or later we will have to face this reality head on. The conviction that there exists no hope beyond this life that is already filled with suffering has caused lots of harm indeed, both on a personal psychological level, but also on a societal level. Christopher Hitchens used to remark that the cruelty of Christianity is that we are made sick, yet commanded to be well. But the alternative that New Atheism proposes is hardly any less cruel. We have to accept that our lives are fundamentally meaningless and futile, yet we are commanded to live life as if it had meaning. Of course, this obvious question of purpose and death is one that the New Atheists have been asked. So, what was their response?
I read a book, Consolation of Philosophy. The main guy, Boethius, is condemned to death. He has everything taken from him. All he has is his reason and his sense of self. Not even that. But he attempts to console himself to this execution by reasoning that the world has order, that there is something that keeps things together, and he uses his reason to try and get to the root of why he should be at peace at death. The problem is, his source of origin is a belief in God. What would you do?
I would request that my body in death be buried, not cremated, so that the energy content contained within it gets returned to the earth so that flora and fauna can dine upon it, just as I have dined upon flora and fauna throughout my life.
Here, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who one might call the spiritual successor of Carl Sagan, echoes the cosmic religion that was earlier promoted by Einstein and Sagan. One ought to take comfort in the knowledge that we were always part of the cosmos and that we continue to be part of it, though in a different form. Some people might claim that this sufficiently comforts them. I'm not sure it can. Knowing and understanding the cosmos is fundamentally an intellectual exercise. Some might like such exercises, some might not, but either way, it's just another distraction, not in essence very different from other distractions, such as playing sports or partying. As long as this distraction works, it will help you to keep going in life. But the distraction can stop working. John von Neumann was an extremely gifted thinker. But once that gift was no longer functioning, there was a dreadful emptiness that somehow had to be filled. It is for this reason that the cosmic religion of Einstein and Sagan, in spite of all its beauty and virtues, I cannot consider sufficient by itself. So what then do we conclude about New Atheism? There were certainly some positive aspects to it, and valuable lessons to be learned. It is a good thing to stand up against harmful and overly dogmatic ideologies, to question blind faith, and to communicate the wonders of nature as revealed by science. However, we find that these things are encouraged in Christianity as well. Jesus publicly confronted the Pharisees for their religious hypocrisy. When God responded to Job, he took Job on a virtual tour of the cosmos, showing him the grandness and intricacies of nature. And indeed, many great scientists who contributed to our modern-day understanding of the world were devout Christians. Therefore, to address the valid concerns that the New Atheists pointed out, it is not at all necessary to completely get rid of our moral foundation and purpose of life. What's perhaps more important is to be reminded of who Christ is, what he was sent to do, and what he commanded us. He was not sent as a political tool for one specific country or race to defend against unwanted cultural influences. Nor was he a feel-good myth or a self-help manual. When we lose sight of his true nature and purpose, we do so at our own peril.